Welcome back to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host Dr. Reid Robison and I are joined by Paul Austin. Paul is the CEO and founder of The Third Wave. The Third Wave is a public benefit corporation. Their mission and vision, reading from their website, is to share trusted research-based content that helps you feel safe, supported, and empowered as you follow your path towards personal transformation. Our vision is to help co-create a global movement that embraces psychedelic use as a way to heal ourselves and our world. We're playing our part by building a cohesive platform that meets individual needs, offers guided support, enables integrated experiences, and fosters meaningful connections across our global ecosystem. Really enjoyed this conversation with Paul. We discussed the utility of microdosing, the importance of rites of passage and community. We talked about psychedelic literacy and education, altered states leading to altered traits, and much, much more. Paul's a super thoughtful guy, very articulate, very creative, a real trailblazer. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Paul Austin. All right, we're here with Paul Austin of The Third Wave. Thanks for joining us on Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, Paul.
Hey, Steve. Hey, Reid. It's good to be here. Excited to dive in.
Yeah. Welcome. Good to chat with you.
So in the spirit of diving in, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience for those who might not know who you are or know anything about The Third Wave?
So in 2009, end of 2009, between Christmas and New Year's, I did my first psychedelic mushroom experience. I was 19 years old and a sophomore in college. And it was interesting, but not like, I did about 1.7 grams, I think. So interesting of cubensis, interesting, but not like profoundly mystical and life-changing. And then about 5 months later, I did LSD for the first time, probably about 250 micrograms with a few friends outdoors on like a beautiful mid-spring day at the beach in Lake Michigan, forest and a lot of other beautiful, amazing things. And that's when the sort of light bulb turned on for me that there might be something to these psychedelics. So about 2 weeks after that, I went to Tanzania with a school trip. I was studying medicine at the time. I studied medicine the first couple of years at undergrad. And then I took organic chemistry and evolutionary biology, and I played soccer and was in a fraternity at the same time. And I was like, I'm not going to keep doing this. Reid can
That's a lot.
Those are incompatible.
I got to make some decisions, some choices here. And the school that I went to was a liberal arts school called Hope College. So Christian, reform, but also very, I think very high level in terms of pre-med and getting people in the medical school and all that. So it was just too intense of a schedule. Anyway, so at the age of 19, I went to Tanzania for field studies, which essentially meant going on safari, and brought some LSD with me to Tanzania because it's quite easy to at that point to travel with it. And then proceeded to do a couple hits of acid in the Serengeti and the Ngorongoro crater, two of the sort of most well-known national parks in Tanzania. And that's when I sort of felt this sense of interconnectedness to everything. I sort of was plugged into this circle of life, sort of felt the magic that it could bring. And so from that point forward, I really thought, it'd be hard to live a more conventional life after having these experiences with LSD. What would it look like to pursue, at least for my 20s, a decade of unconventional living where I, pursue entrepreneurship, nomadic traveling, writing books, public speaking, and just sort of like throw myself out there because you don't have whole lot to lose in your 20s. And so, at the age of 21, I moved to Turkey. I taught English there for a year. In a private school, took those skill sets, applied sort of the 4-hour work week principle of move to Thailand, live really inexpensively, bootstrap my first business. And then I sold that business in 2017 while living in New York City and proceeded to live, basically 10 places in 10 years. So at this point I'm in Miami, but I've lived in Eden in Utah. I've lived in New York, Oakland, Lisbon, Oaxaca, Chiang Mai, and Izmir in Turkey. And the sort of constant thread through all that has been psychedelics and the work that I've done with psychedelics, and sort of like being at the sort of pioneering forefront futuristic application of how psychedelics might transform our paradigms and models. And so naturally through that, I thought the biggest gap when we started Third Wave in 2015, the biggest gap was just education and general stigma I think the stigma started to recede greatly in 2018 when Michael Pollan published How to Change Your Mind. And now, I know it still exists and it's still out there, and sometimes for good reason, but it's not near to the point that it was, even 7 years ago. And so the idea with Third Wave was, how could we use a topic like microdosing to sort of normalize responsible psychedelic use from a cultural lens? Because as a student of history, so after medicine, I ended up getting a degree in history. As a student of history, the patterns repeat themselves over time. And what happened in the 60s was Leary basically came out and said, let's dose everyone in high doses of acid. You had the Merry Pranksters, you had Ken Kesey, you had it associated with the Vietnam War. And so I thought, if we're going to do this again, let's be a little bit more clever. And let's start with microdosing instead of like full dosing. And if people want to dip their toe in further, they can do that. So that's the lens through which I've built. There were a couple other projects as well. I started a legal psilocybin retreat center in the Netherlands called Synthesis, which is now about a retreat center in Oregon, to help pioneer legal psilocybin experiences there. Wrote a book on microdosing, and just launched a training program for coaches where we're training people on the skill of psychedelics, which I think we'll talk about more.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you giving us that intro, because it features something that I see in a lot of folks who are in this movement, industry, whatever word you want to pick to describe it. And that is a life-altering psychedelic experience, right? Where the toothpaste is out of the tube and you can't get it back in. You see yourself differently, you see the world differently. And then you're sort of confronted with this question: what do I do now? How do I now live with intention? Because I feel like I can't choose not to.
Right. It's like a matter of alignment, so to say, right? Once you realize the truth of who you are, the truth of what is through some of these psychedelic experiences. I mean, many people do go back to the lives they once lived, but there's this sort of awareness of friction and tension and maybe even disease that almost has to be adjusted or healed for someone to really grow and develop. So psychedelics do a great job with awareness. And then, sometimes that breaks people. These aren't. I think I was fortunate to some degree that I had a reasonably solid childhood. I had no early adverse childhood experiences. I had relatively good attachment. And so even when I dove into, I definitely had a couple bad trips, which fucking freaked the shit out of me. But generally,
Right.
I was safe, and the experiences were really profound and meaningful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, something that I'm sure you talk about on your website and in your coaching programs, that we talk a lot about in the psychedelic assisted therapy world, and that is setting, but also integration. Right? You have these profound, what could be profound experiences, or incredibly destabilizing experiences, and sometimes what makes all the difference into whether or not it becomes life changing in a good way is the container and the education, the support that you have to make sense of it and integrate it into your life.
Right. And I love that you mentioned those three, because set is like the prep, kind of what's your mindset going in. Setting is the experience. It's when you're actually sitting, what's the actual environment. Integration is the after, so to say. And integration is, I think it's fractal in nature, in that it's both individual and collective. And right now we're really focused a lot on individual integration, because that's the easiest place to start, is changing the hearts and minds of individuals, so to say, or healing them. But inevitably integration has to become collective. And I think that's the much larger task that's at hand, is how do you create a system, a society, business, politic, law, that's rooted in sort of interconnectedness, or some of these truths that we come to when we're working with psychedelics. What does an integrative landscape look like, so to say, right? So that way it's not just who we are inside, but it's what's reflected outside of us as well.
I'm curious to hear you sort of riff on. Hopefully, this wasn't a rhetorical question. How do we create community and a collective around this type of enlightened consciousness, or the attitudes that people experience changes in when they have personal psychedelic experiences? Because I see with the third wave, like, you're trying to increase psychedelic literacy, right? So you have great education, free education on your website about different psychedelic compounds and instructions on microdosing, things like that. But what do you see? I mean, who knows exactly what to do, but what do you see are maybe some of the paths forward with creating and building the kind of community you're talking about?
Yeah. So I'll zoom out a little bit, because I recently read a couple books by a guy named Martin Prechtel. Martin is he's half Swiss French and he's also half Navajo, and he wrote a book called Long Life, Honey in the Heart. He essentially moved to Guatemala and became a shaman near Lake Atitlan, and he has this beautiful end to one of his books, which talks about this role of initiation and sort of the quest, particularly for men, to be initiated. And this was started with the work largely of Robert Bly and Iron John, and I mean actually Joseph Campbell really first, and then Robert Bly, and so Martin, what he says is like this isn't going to be as simple as just doing these rites of passage in a Western industrialized world. The fabric of that goes much, much deeper, right? These indigenous traditions of, for example, initiation have gone on for eons, sometimes thousands of years. Time is sort of the best arbiter of what is valuable, and we as a Western industrialized world, we're fairly nascent in development. Just 300 to 400 years. A lot of what we are going through feels alien. We feel alienated because it's rooted in sort of this premise of extractivism. And in order to heal that, there's a sense of communities need to be they need to be more integral to who we are. They need to be more integral to our lives, and that could be reflected in the way that we live, right? In most suburban landscape, we were talking about college earlier, right? So many people love college because they get to live in a dorm, right? They get to live with all their friends, and then we graduate from that. We live in these little isolated boxes, like that. I mean, it's just so alienating for that. And then people work in jobs where it's largely rooted in competition instead of support. It's a lot of like deep kind of manipulation and other stuff. And I think people are just realizing there's a better way in which we can live. And so if we look at community as really a central healing component, because nothing can be removed from it as a human, it's part and parcel of who we are. Then we're really looking at, how are we cultivating more pro-social tendencies? How are we cultivating more extroversion? How are we cultivating, doing more things with our hands and less things in technology? So many people that I talk to about community, particularly like in the tech space, are obsessed with what's the tactic, what's the app? Is it going to be Discord or is it going to be Slack or is it WhatsApp? Where really the question is more like, what experiences are you creating for people that prove to be tremendously, helpful for bonding and connection and authenticity and vulnerability? And psychedelic retreats are a fantastic way to make that. I mean, when we think about community, we often think of church, right? Whether it's, I grew up going to church every Sunday for 4 hours every Sunday, basically, mission trips and all the like. I know, in terms of where you guys are located in Utah, Mormonism is huge, and that's often been sort of the community that's provided. So probably the new community is something like, or a new element of that community is a ritual. It's something that happens consistently. It's something that I think needs to be rooted in some sort of spiritual practice of connection to source or mystery or something beyond. But it can't be sort of rigid and dogmatic like more traditional religions that, because it doesn't adapt to what people are really looking for, I suppose, the questions that we're asking. Some examples I think of communities that I've really loved to see develop are these places in like Costa Rica that are essentially starting villages. And I'm sure you two have heard of this. This is happening in British Columbia and many other places, where, you buy a plot of land and you build a home there, and, they're starting to put schools in, and there's sort of the intention is in the next 10 years to create this intentional community, a commune, essentially, right? So again, we're back to things from the 60s that didn't go so well. And so just like psychedelics didn't go so well, communes really didn't end up so well, stigmatized because of sort of the cult mentality or what could emerge from that. And so I think another question that a lot of people are faced with when they're talking about community is just like, what does healthy use of psychedelics look like? What is a healthy use of community, so to say? And how could that be essentially created in such a way where these communities are sovereign in nature, where they become these city states, these places that have localized governance? Balaji's, who's this sort of tech brilliant guy, talks about the networked state and how the network state will evolve from the nation state, and that network state will have it will be a DAO that will have a type of currency. It will be rooted in both the cloud and physical places. Those physical places will be non-contiguous, meaning they do not need to share borders. And I think that's an interesting model for the role that psychedelics could play in like helping to develop the complexity that we navigate our sovereignty and sort of what country we consider ourselves a part of, which is, again, just really community.
All of a sudden, psychedelics and Bitcoin blend together quite well, huh?
Well, there's that one quote from I won't name the investor, but you might know, who says, I finally understood Bitcoin when I did mushrooms. It's kind of
yeah, that's a fascinating
the consciousness blockchain.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, I was going to ask though in this, because I agree with you completely on the power of groups, the power of ritual ceremony, and the mystical and bringing people together. We love doing group work, retreat work, or group work, but in this online world, what does that look like? Besides that commune idea that you pointed out didn't go so well, what does it look like on the internet? Is there a community around third wave? How do you see it?
Yeah, and that's where I think internet, my personal sense is like it can only be a part. It's my sense is it's difficult to build community well purely online. In fact, this is even what I would say, like with third wave, we've largely been virtual. We've started to do some retreats as part of the coaching training program. And the way our community has developed in the last year, just from doing 2 retreats. I mean, these are high ticket items. These are coaches who are really committed, but still, just from doing those 2 retreats, we've seen some outsized returns. I mean, we've done webinars for our online community. There's definitely, in terms of the classes or the programs that we do, we have a forum where people can interact and navigate. We'll likely launch a Discord channel at some point. I would love to make third wave into a DAO as well, and facilitate that. That's definitely of interest. But the sort of decentralized landscape of technology, DeFi and blockchain and DAOs and crypto, I see it as still being quite nascent. It's kind of sort of in toddler stage at this point. I think it'll be another 2 to 3 to 4 years before it really becomes useful, even in the way that I would want to use it to further develop an online community. It feels like, just to land this, that even the tools that we have available for cultivating community online are still quite young and immature. And I'm sure we'll even develop those further because I always come back to, I'm like, this is a conversation we have internally at the team. It's like, do we start a Slack for our community? Do we start a Discord? Do we start a forum? Do we start a Reddit thread? Do we start a Facebook group? Do we start a WhatsApp group? Right? There's like 8 different choices, and not one is really any better than the other is sort of my sense. So that, I think, has been the hardest gap to figure out, is how do you get more hive mind stuff going on with, the people in our community.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of, sometimes then the internet and the humans do what they're going to do. Like, I'm thinking of TikTok and how yesterday my 2 13-year-old boys went to the Minions movie with their friends. And apparently there's this trend where teenagers, young kids will dress up in suits and go see the new Minions movie, and they'll cheer at certain times because this was a TikTok thing. I looked it up and it's hilarious.
The way trends spread, right? The way trends spread now, it's crazy.
Well, and
memes
and the internet and exactly, the mimetic nature of these messages are viral. I love the term virality because it is quite literal what happens. They become mind viruses that now can spread because we're all connected via the internet. And when I say all of us, you hear people like Tristan Harris talk about what is it, like 80% of the content on a platform like Twitter is produced by maybe 6% of the users. And so you talk about community online. There are certain things that I think online as a tool, as you said, is not going to be able to transcend. Certain limitations it will not be able to transcend. It cannot be a one-to-one replacement for in-person communing. There's a difference, I think, between communing and communicating. online tools are great communication tools. I can send you a message through email or on a Slack channel or in Discord, or I can send you a video on Snapchat or whatever. And it's this sort of asynchronous communication. We can call on the phone, but there's got to be. I mean, as a psychologist, I want to believe this.
Mhm.
There's got to be something unique that we can't transcend with digital communication about being in the physical presence of another person. Not the least of which are freaking pheromones. Like you're actually
Pheromones and
smelling another
hormones
human
and-
being, right? And if you believe in energy and vibrations and that kind of shit, then there's that you're feeling from the other person too. But like you talk about the communes, these are people living together. And when human beings gather in collectives, there are certain things that history teaches us and human psychology, the study of human psychology teaches us tend to happen, that I wonder if psychedelics used consciously, purposely, and skillfully, as you talk about, could help us evolve above, like hierarchies, right? Human beings tend to be hierarchical apes.
Right. So maybe it can help us to get out of that. And I think that's sort of like that's a big question, right? Okay, I want to back out here, because what's coming up for me is like altered states lead to altered traits is a common phrase that I like. And those altered traits, whether it's values or behaviors or whatever, right? It's almost like how can the insight of a psychedelic, that input, be translated into an output where our behaviors reflect that sort of interconnected nature, right? And so to root this, I think concepts and principles around regenerative farming, right? I don't think it's any coincidence that Michael Pollan wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma and then went into writing about psychedelics after that. The two are intimately tied together, right? So regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming. I would say even with what Elon is doing, in some ways, this is like he's sort of the grandfather of a regenerative economy, where he's creating solar and he's creating, electric cars. And there's a way to essentially build systems in society that don't require extractivism in order to function. But that's a huge and heavy lift. And it's such a long timeline and horizon and way longer than one lifetime from that awareness or that insight to, again, we were like talking about integrative living, to actually being in a situation and place where you're living integrated, right? That probably, for a full societal transformation, that probably won't happen in our lifetime. So I think it's also just like, it's a little hard to fathom and imagine what that future actually looks like. There's a part of me that wants to think like we can cut time in half and we can actually warp time to make it happen much quicker. And some might argue that will be necessary to avoid sort of catastrophic, a catastrophic apocalypse, like through climate change or whatever. But there's another part of me that thinks, hey, this just might take a while.
I'm remembering a quote that from I believe Ready Player One, which is quite apropos. It's like, for a bunch of hairless apes, we've actually managed to invent some pretty incredible things.
Yeah, so I hope we can invent ourselves into progress and not into annihilation, because that's my worry. It's like I forget who the quote's attributed to, but we have what is it? Paleolithic emotions, industrial social structure, and godlike technology, something like that. I'm totally butchering it, but we've developed in some ways probably too much. And it's like people who take steroids and their muscles develop fast and outpace their tendons and ligaments, and so they easily injure themselves. So we've got some strong muscles, but we're in danger of tearing ligaments because we're developing asymmetrically.
We're developing asymmetrically, and the balance of that is wisdom, right? That's what people often say, that the sort of or depth of knowing, or Jung might call it shadow work, right? Where you essentially confront death and you see through death and you move through it. Going back to our conversation on initiation, right? If we have these Paleolithic emotions, but we have the technology of gods, well, we to balance this out, we also have to have the interesting enough, the insight heights of God or the depths of gods or the capacity of gods, right? And so, as Nietzsche said, God is dead. So these gods that we once thought were above us or below us or outside of us, psychedelics are now help us to realize that there is actually a God inside of us, and that to manage the complexity of this technology that we've now been granted and not see everything go sideways, how can psychedelics, going back to these altered traits, cultivate traits around wisdom and compassion and awareness and understanding? And that way, these sort of enlightened Buddhas, right, throughout the history of time, we've seen the Buddha, we've seen Jesus, we've seen Muhammad, we've seen Saint Thomas Aquinas, we've seen many other highly spiritually developed individuals that have led to these religions that have sort of lasted sometimes for thousands and thousands of years. And I think now with tools like psychedelics or neurofeedback or breathwork or meditation, the capacity for enlightenment is becoming more accessible, right? And so then the capacity to cultivate that wisdom and depth, sometimes through initiation or the environment in which we live, maybe is one of those ways that we can balance out the technology that we've been granted. Because I think without that stopgap, so to say, we very well could sort of blow ourselves up, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, I like that.
Could you expand on how you see initiation in this? Because I mean, of course, I'm a Joseph Campbell fan, but I'm just trying to connect that dot of what you said about these rites of passage and initiation with psychedelic community. Is it just like taking the medicine and opening up to that expanded worldview?
So, from what I understand, this was true of the Aboriginals. This was true of people in Native American traditions. This is true of the Incans and even the Aztecs. This is true of most indigenous landscapes around the world. They basically had this this process of initiation, and from what I understand, the core of that was essentially confronting death, basically killing the boy so the man could arise from that. And the Aboriginals had their way of doing it. Various indigenous groups in terms of the Iroquois or the Incans had their way of doing it. And although it wasn't necessarily every single indigenous society used plant medicines, some did, because my sense is they are much safer than other indigenous rituals or traditions where sometimes boys would be sent out in the wild to survive for 2 weeks, or they'd have to fight wild animals, or they would be beat to an absolute pulp till they were on the verge of death physically. And so I think the idea with psychedelics is it's sort of a more refined, sophisticated, safe way to allow for that initiation, to allow for the catharsis, and maintain physical health and well-being, to allow for like that sort of that start of the hero's journey. Like, who am I? Why am I here? What am I here to do? What is my contribution? How do I not necessarily just live my life as a sycophant consuming, but how do I actually grow up, mature, to contribute and be of service to something that is much, much way beyond what I could ever fathom or imagine?
Yeah, I'm thinking of these comments about wisdom and the initiation being a process of obtaining wisdom. And I'm thinking about it in terms of transcendence, like Maslow's top pinnacle of the hierarchy. Above self-actualization is transcendence, to transcend those things that the human mind tends to accumulate or fall into traps around. If we don't have greater perspective. And to me, perspective is another way of saying wisdom. And psychedelics have this incredible way of granting us the perspective I might attribute to a god. You talked about God and deity before, and these bodhisattvas, right? These wise ones, is one thing that a deity has that a human's consciousness doesn't necessarily, is eternal perspective. It sees all things at once. Everything is one eternal now. And with that great perspective, it is not impulsive. It is not destructive. It can make the quote unquote right choice because it has all the data. And if there's something that we hear like reliably from people coming out of these psychedelic experiences in which they felt a connection to God or the God within themselves, it is that they have all these pro-social desires, right? not a whole lot of people come out of LSD or MDMA or psilocybin wanting to murder everybody, right? Or wanting to dominate the competition, or like, I finally found out how I'm going to win at capitalism.
So true. Okay, can I insert a Terence McKenna quote intermission just because it keeps coming to mind and I love this one. It's admit it, you aren't like them. You're not even close. You may occasionally dress yourself up as one of them, watch the same mindless television shows as they do, maybe even eat the same fast food sometimes. But it seems that the more you try to fit in, the more you feel like an outsider. Watching the normal people as they go about their automatic existences, for every time you say club passwords like "have a nice day" and "weather's awful today," you yearn inside to say forbidden things like "tell me something that makes you cry," or "what do you think deja vu is for?" Face it, you even want to talk to that girl in the elevator. But what if that girl in the elevator and the balding man who walks past your cubicle at work are thinking the same thing? Who knows what you might learn from taking a chance on a conversation with a stranger? Everyone carries a piece of the puzzle. Nobody comes into your life by mere coincidence. Trust your instincts, do the unexpected, find the others.
Holy crap. That's my new favorite quote. Find the others.
Find the others. And that encapsulates it right there. Find the others who I suppose, to go back to your point, Steve, find the others who can see things from that eternal perspective. Right? Because that's who you want to play. That's who you want to build businesses with. That's who you want to have families with, right? It's the infinite game. Mm-hmm. It comes back to the infinite game versus finite game, and how expansive we can be in our perspective.
That's why it's so fun to go to like conferences, like psychedelic conferences, or just meetups and groups with people who have had transcendent experiences, because there's an automatic kinship, right? You can do, we found the others, right? You can do what Terence is talking about, and we can skip past the how's your day, how's the weather, and straight to, what makes you cry. And you see that popping up a lot, especially in this relatively post-COVID era. I'm noticing there's lots of integration circles, or there's men's circles. I'm just, because I'm a dude, I've been looking at communities for men to get together and do man shit. But some of that man shit isn't, it's not talk about football. Right. It's stare into each other's face and talk about our insecurities and receive validation, and challenge each other, right? Not the stereotypical, what some might call toxic masculinity, but the enlightened masculine, and cultivating that in one another.
That's important.
Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent, but yeah.
No, I mean, it's important. It puts a full circle on all the conversations that we've been having around initiation and alignment and the role that psychedelics might play. And I think it's particularly is true and hits home for men, because the more masculine personality, it tends to be more rigid, closed off. There tends to be more emotion that's repressed. There tends to be less extroversion. And part of what psychedelics, that I experienced with psychedelics, was it helped me to be a lot more pro-social and extroverted, and sort of to navigate that landscape.
Yeah. Speaking of the closed offness of some people and stigma you mentioned earlier, this is a nice segue into the coaching versus clinical world, at least the way I've been thinking about it. So I'm a licensed psychologist, psychotherapist, been a therapist for many years. And I've noticed that still, even though there's much progress been done around the stigma around seeking help from a therapist, there are a lot of people, especially men, who wouldn't be caught dead in a therapy office, would never go to therapy. Usually their only experience of therapy is when their romantic partner drags them into couples counseling, and then they don't want to be there, and then they feel ganged up on because the therapist is talking about how he needs to do better by her. So the coaching world, though, something I've observed is that men are often a lot more willing to get a coach, to get help from a coach, than they are from a therapist. Because getting help from a therapist implies, and these are terrible implications that aren't true, but implies that they are weak, that they are crazy, that they have a mental illness. They're going to go talk about how their dad didn't love them, and why am I going to do that? I don't want to do that. But they can go to a coach, right? Because I had a baseball coach, and that was cool. And a coach will help me kick ass, and I like kicking ass. But a lot of the coaches I've met, especially the really good ones, there's a lot of overlap between what psychotherapists do and really good coaches do in getting people to go inside, really look at their shadow, and make substantive changes. So I'm curious, Paul, because you talked about you're doing coaching trainings. Would you mind talking about the coaching work that you're doing around psychedelics too?
Yeah. So the way I look at coaching is therapy, and this is a generalization. So all generalizations are going to have exceptions. But generally
Right.
speaking, therapy, the therapeutic orientation is helpful to get people to sort of back to baseline, especially if they're going through a midlife crisis and they're facing their shadow for the first time. And just to use your example, and maybe they need to start to see a therapist to actually understand what's going on down there and how do they navigate it. And that I would consider to be part of getting back to baseline, and then coaching to really help with expansion, performance, becoming your quote unquote best self. Now, for all of us in the either therapeutic or personal development space, there's never a time where you won't necessarily be confronted with shadow work. The exception
Mm.
would be if you are quote unquote already enlightened, or if you basically, yeah, if you're already enlightened, or you've self transcended, if you're the Dalai Lama, then. But most of us still have our shadow work to be doing, and so it's always sort of like you still got to go into the depths, as Robert Bly said. You got to go into the swamp and bucket it out one by one, and that creates a spaciousness for the development to reach even higher peaks, because as you cultivate more depth, going back to wisdom and depth, as you cultivate more depth, you can build a bigger presence on top of that. So as you both know, there are a lot of training programs that have come out in the last even just year now in the psychedelic
Mm-hmm.
space. They are by and large focused on the clinical medical therapeutic model. Most of their curriculum is focused on that orientation in terms of why psychedelics are efficacious for clinical conditions, for healing in particular. Some are very clinical in that, like a CIAS or a MAPS. Others, like Psychedelics Today, are less clinical in that, but they still bring in a lot of doctors. The way that I've always looked at things is, I love this quote by Buckminster Fuller, which is don't fix a broken system, just create a new one that makes the old one obsolete, right? So essentially it's getting
Mm.
back into what we've talked about already, which is creating new paradigms. So what I'm really interested in is how coaching can be used to help individuals create new paradigms for themselves, to clarify their vision, clarify what it is that they wish to create in the world, and then to actually take the steps necessary and to hold a certain level of accountability to help them reach that goal, that vision of what they are achieving, of what they are looking to bring out into the world. And the reason psychedelics, I think, are such effective tools at facilitating that is because at the higher dose level, they're very helpful in allowing us to zoom way out and see things from, again, this eternal perspective. Right? If time was not an issue, if money was not an issue, if I wasn't stuck in sort of the contractions and scarcity of the monkey mind in everyday life, who is it that I would want to be? What is it that I would want to create? Right? That sense of freedom and unconditional capacity, I think, is really, really empowering. And so when you're able to get people in that state and facilitate that, they are not going to be restricted by the normal fear in sort of a normal everyday state. They'll have this sort of this capacity to dream, this capacity to imagine that might not be feasible in a normal waking state. And then if you look at something like, let's say, microdosing, which the jury is still out on, I know, from a research perspective, and we can talk more about that because I think it's developing in some interesting ways. But then you look at something like microdosing or even low dosing. Those are very helpful at sort of like, once you get the North Star set with visionary doses of psychedelics, how do you actually lubricate that path to make it just smoother? And so we look at practices and behaviors like microdosing that help to facilitate BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is a precursor to neuroplasticity. Microdosing is also anti-inflammatory, so it helps to manage chronic inflammation, which allows for a better mood, more energy, things like that. And so much like you would take a supplement, or much like you'd pay attention to your diet, or you get 8 hours, I wear an Oura ring, you get 8 hours of sleep a night, right? What are those behavioral practices that are going to help to facilitate you creating what it is you wish to create? And so broadly then, if I zoom way out and I look at those three: visionary doses, microdosing, and then non-psychedelic modalities. They could be diet, exercise, sleep. They could be meditation, yoga, breath work. They could be, hot, cold thermogenesis. There's many other modalities. How do we calibrate those three tools to facilitate outcomes? First, for ourselves, that's a lot of what I focus on, at least in our training program, is first go within and apply this to you and learn how you are going to continue to adapt. And then how do we help guide our clients and help them to clarify, to refine, to feel empowered? And how can psychedelics help us to achieve that, to create that? So I think that's probably the main thing. Whereas my sense is with the therapeutic lens, it tends to be a lot of like you are struggling with depression, you are struggling with opiate addiction, use disorder, you are you have chronic PTSD from a very traumatic event, and these tools are going to be phenomenal at helping you to open up the unconscious, the subconscious, open up the repressed memory, open up that part of yourself that wasn't loved, and that you need to develop healthier attachment. And I think a therapist is phenomenal for that. So that is it's a both and world in that way. I think both, we need to balance both, and ideally as more people heal, what I'm also anticipating is there's a lot more healing that comes through with psychedelics. More and more people are going to want to step into that creative orientation. And so what I'm also preparing for is, a decade from now, how do we set this lens, the lens of creation, as the core lens? Because right now I think in psychedelics, the core lens is the therapeutic modality.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary of the distinction, and I wish in the real world it played out so simply. I'm just thinking of every client I've seen go through the process of therapy or coaching. Like, the past is never irrelevant, although it probably should be more irrelevant than it presents itself as. And the healing work is never really done, although there are some big skeletons in the closet that spill out, often at the time of your first psychedelic experience when you least want it to.
Right.
And yeah, we have a shortage of providers and like clinicians and coaches to send people to, especially with the regulations of state laws and country boundaries that I'm faced with on a daily basis. So yeah, I'm just realizing how interconnected those two approaches are, especially in psychedelic medicine, even in the clinical realm.
Yeah, I mean, we, when I'd started, even just to speak to that, Reid, when I'd started Synthesis, we were doing these psilocybin wellness retreats, and we screened everyone out who was on a medication at that time,
Yeah.
and we're very strict in that. And there were still people who, inevitably when they came to the retreat and did 7 grams of mushrooms, thinking it's a wellness retreat, they come to realize that their mom didn't love them, or like there's that's always the hard lesson to learn initially, is even people who are coming in from a high performance perspective, usually there's a few skeletons to clean before they can actually get to the fun stuff, so to say.
Yeah, most often, like we all have them to one degree or another, right? It seems.
Yeah, that high performance comment is interesting because I've noticed that a lot of the folks who maybe they come in for high performance help. A lot of them are in the world of achieving because they're trying to fill a gaping hole in their heart left by neglect or trauma. And they're using a lot of their insecurities, or they're using their pain as what I call the dirty burning fuel to propel them into success. And I'm putting air quotes around success because usually in this space, when people say success, they mean a shit ton of money, right? Or they mean
Fame.
adulation, fame, right? Attention. And so a lot of these folks, they'll get those things, they'll check those boxes and find that they are unhappy. I mean, how many times do we have to hear, oh yeah, I know some billionaires that are really unhappy, to understand this point, this principle? So yeah, I think there's tremendous overlap.
So then it gets in like, how do we define success? How do we define meaning, purpose, fulfillment? What creates a life? And I think we go back to community. So, and it kind of comes full circle then in terms of like, so if the healing work is not, it's never individual. If the healing work is always done, I think in community, and part of this healing that you're witnessing or experiencing is a sense of optics changing. what one thought was previously valuable is no longer relevant or valuable, and how do we lead someone and grow them out of that? Because the truth is, I think the fixation on money is sort of like it's a thing of this immature ego. Money's helpful, money's necessary, but like anything else in excess, it becomes toxic and poisonous. So I think that's also part of the work, is just getting people to like remember what actually brings them healing and meaning and fulfillment. And unless they're a psychopath, it's usually not, fame and money and all those other things. But that's a whole nother point, because there are a lot of psychopaths out there.
Right. A lot of them at the top of important organizations.
Exactly. or like presidents, in some ways.
Right. Yeah, I like your use of the word remember. I think, it maybe implies that at our default, right, when we enter this world, this is our nature, our nature to know these things about us, about what's meaningful, about what really will make us well and happy and fulfilled and connected. And then it gets conditioned out of us, or beaten out of us, or frightened out of us. We forget. And so we have to either remember or relearn.
Psychedelics remind us of our true nature. I like that definition.
I like that too. It's almost like the deconditioning,
I did find that quote that I butchered before. It's by E.O. Wilson. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology.
Medieval institutions.
I was close.
Very close.
I was close. Well, Paul, this has been a stimulating conversation. Is there anything else that you want to share with our audience? And I have a tendency to make like we're wrapping up before Reid is done talking about stuff. So Reid, I'd invite you to share or ask Paul any questions.
I want to talk some more. Just kidding. Nothing to add. Your question is completely valid. What's on Paul's mind?
Yeah.
Well, I think the only other thing would be to talk a little bit about some of the microdosing research, and I think how that could be improved. And
I like that.
And let's see, I think that's about, that's all. That's the only other thing that I had top of mind.
Because you wrote a book on microdosing, correct?
I wrote a book, and I have a new one coming out in a couple months. I'm just finalizing the manuscript with a lot of just updates. It's kind of the same basic skeleton, but a lot of updates and all that.
Because we get asked a lot about it by our clients, our clinicians who we supervise, and get asked a lot about it, and because of all of our shared interest in this. And as a clinical trialist, I like to follow along the papers that come out too. And I realize that that's a tricky thing to study methodologically. And some of the recent studies that might point a finger at placebo response might be premature in their conclusions. And I'll be the first to admit we need a mountain more of data and good solid study design. But I would love to hear your take on it, having been a part of this field for so long.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. It's like the research has been mixed. Some of the clinical trials have shown that there is a dose response to, let's say, 6 and 13 and 20 micrograms of LSD. The Beckley Foundation did in vitro research showing that, microdoses of LSD increased BDNF. There's been a lot of sort of qualitative research done on Reddit subthreads and through apps like microdose.me with Paul Stamets that have shown that when people are self-reporting, so observational research, that people are seeing benefits. And yet there's been, experimental research done at, University of Chicago with Harriet DeWitt, and I think at Maastricht University that's shown less than, useful output, so to say. So it's really quite a mixed bag. I make a few things of it. One, the researchers that I know who have studied research or who have published research on microdosing, who didn't care much for it, who have always been outspoken opponents of it, their research tends to reflect their hypothesis or assumption, which is that it really has no effect. And that researchers who in some ways had used it and had benefited from it have been creating research that shows that, hey, it actually is positive and beneficial. And so it's a really
Paul, are you implying there's bias in research?
amazing, right? Incredible.
How dare you?
And so
Steve,
go ahead, Reid.
did you not know that you can torture the data to tell it what you want to hear?
I'd heard rumors. I'm just, my worldview has been shattered. Talk about a perspective shift.
Right.
Anyway,
And so it's fun to see that emerge in real time. My sense of like it's still so early stage. Most of the research is on high dose, high dose psilocybin, high dose MDMA, high dose ayahuasca. There's a bit of research that's on psycholytic dosing, which would be low dosing of psychedelics in conjunction with something like psychotherapy or coaching even. And I think to really get a much broader understanding of how psychedelics work and how they will be integrated into our culture, we need a lot more research, not just on microdosing, but low dosing in general. It could be low dosing of ketamine. It could be low dosing of LSD, low dosing of psilocybin, low dosing of even something like ayahuasca, right? What does that impact like on the gut? What does that impact on the brain? How does that change behavioral patterns? That's what I'd like to see more of. And then also, a lot of the microdosing research has not really paid attention to the usefulness of a coach or a guide. For a lot of the MDMA assisted psychotherapy research or the psilocybin assisted psychotherapy research, they do extensive therapeutic sessions before, during, and after, which people say lend to a lot of the efficacy that is seen. And I think they need to do similar trials and studies with microdosing and low dosing to combine it with coaching or therapy or whatever it is, because that's part of the paradigm that we're transforming, is sort of a pill prescription paradigm into a much more care-based paradigm. And I think that is, again, back to the conversation topic of community, that human to human interaction is central to the healing process. The medicine helps, but as we've seen now from research over the last, I think, 40 years, SSRIs are actually no more effective than placebo. And I think that's obviously a whole nother conversation, but it just shows that psychedelics are helpful, but a lot of it is about the care and the catalyst.
And I think that one's subject to the same bias as what you mentioned about microdosing, is those who are really not fans of the pharmaceutical industry and SSRIs, because you can find studies to highlight that. You can find some positive ones. But I will tell you, my favorite microdosing study had the coolest outcome. It was like, I don't know, Van Elk, like a year ago. But this is microdosing led to more awe of videos of funny animals and fuzzy things and moving objects. That was pretty cool.
You got to post a link to that, Reid. I haven't seen that.
We need more awe. Like, we need more awe and savoring and wonder. We're a jaded world right now, which understandably so. But yeah, and the similar to the research on psychedelics and psychotherapy, that psychotherapy seems to be a modulating effect for the efficacy. There's a lot of research that says the same about SSRIs, that SSRIs in combination with psychotherapy do better than either alone. So who knows? Placebo effect is still an effect. Something's going on.
Something's going on. Well, this is fun.
And just to add one more thing, the paper that came out last fall on the citizen science self-blinding, where it was out of the London group, Szigeti, lead author, Carhart Harris on it, Amanda Fielding on it. That one that concluded placebo was the best they could tell. It also had like a 70+% unblinding or broken blinding in participants. So, like, can you answer anything from it? Is my question.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, what usually is an annoying conclusion to almost any research study is we need more data. We need more research.
Which is true, and we can part of being an entrepreneur, or part of writing, or part of just being human is inferencing, making inferences, sort of reading between the lines, and also then developing a trust within ourselves to make choices for ourselves about what's best for ourselves. I think that's also helpful.
Yeah, and like you were saying earlier, like, the scientific method is a method, and it is an incredible method, and I'm glad we have it. It is one epistemology. It's one way of knowing. It's not the only way of knowing.
Yeah, and it's a good point. I mean, real world evidence is a pretty solid source of learning as well. And the harm that someone might get from having a pocket full of psilocybin microdoses is really only around getting arrested, by the police. And so, but there is all that neuroplasticity. Preclinical data to guide us. So yeah, I'm intrigued and pushing for more research for sure.
Well, Paul, thanks for spending an hour with us. Where can people learn more about you and what you're doing?
So Third Wave, the thirdwave.co. We have a newsletter that we send out. There's a directory of providers, clinics, retreats, therapists, coaches. If people are looking to navigate that, we have a bunch of guides on microdosing and all the other psychedelics. I'm on Instagram at Paul Austin 3W and Twitter. So Paul Austin 3W on Instagram and Twitter. And if people want to reach out, have a question about the episode, just shoot me a note, send me a text or not DM, and I'm happy to support.
Cool.
Awesome.
Always fun to chat.
Always fun to chat.
Thank you, dear listener, for listening. It means a lot to me. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Novamind, a mental health company that specializes in psychedelic medicine and research. You can learn more about Novamind's mission to increase access to legal, safe, and evidence-based psychedelic medicine at novamind.ca. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch. Also, if you're feeling generous today, please leave us a glowing review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. If you'd like to reach out to us with questions, suggestions, scathing criticisms, etc., please email us at psychfrontiers@novamind.ca. Thanks again. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Please consult a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.